For around 1500 years, since Upper and Lower Egypt were united under a single crown, the ancient kingdom of Egypt had been ruled by a male pharaoh, with only one exception, the female pharaoh Sobekneferu, who had failed to revitalize her dying dynasty. The pharaoh's power was absolute, and such was their power that they were worshipped after death as gods. But in the 15th century BCE, a woman would be inspired to follow in Sobekneferu's footsteps. She would claim the power of a male king for herself and lead Egypt through 22 years of prosperity. That woman was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was born around 1500 BCE into the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, daughter to Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose, principal royal wife to the pharaoh. Hatshepsut's life would have been one of luxury and comfort, but she still would have been expected to be educated and to prepare herself for her roles in later life. She would have had a tutor who taught her reading and writing from the age of 4 or 5, unusual for most children, but not for the princess. She also would have been groomed for the role of God's wife to Amun, a role her mother held. Hatshepsut, as daughter of the pharaoh and his great wife, would have been treated as the most important child in the palace, but the truth was that a son was still sought out. Her father, Thutmose I, would have had children with his several wives, and it's likely that Hatshepsut shared the royal nursery with a small army of kings' sons and daughters, all her half-brothers and sisters. Only one other full sister is known, named Neferubiti. While there would have been some travel around the various royal palaces of Egypt, it's likely Hatshepsut and her siblings would have spent most of their time at Thebes. While the exact date is not known, when around 12 or 13 years old, she married her half-brother, Thutmose II. As son of one of their father's secondary wives, Thutmose wanted to strengthen his claim by marrying his half-sister, who not only had Queen Ahmose as a mother, but also had the stronger dynastic claim through her maternal grandfather, thought to be Ahmose I. Incestuous marriage between royals in ancient Egypt was common to strengthen dynastic claims, and was practiced in reminder of the belief that pharaohs were gods, in imitation of the sister-brother marriage of the gods Isis and Osiris. Thutmose II's reign was relatively short, but the couple had at least one daughter who survived, named Neferure, but no sons. However, Thutmose did have a son with at least one other of his secondary wives, Iset, the future Thutmose III. After just a few years into his reign, although there is still argument over how long this actually was, Thutmose II died, leaving his widow Hatshepsut to sort out the kingdoms of the Red and White Crowns while still a teenager. However, ancient Egypt had a system already in place for such a problem. Thutmose's infant son, now to become Thutmose III, would be pharaoh, and Hatshepsut would be regent as well as stepmother. It was a tried and tested formula that usually solved all problems around a pharaoh dying too young. Mothers were unlikely to usurp the throne or alienate their own children, and the young pharaoh's power was bound up in the lineage of their mother. This was due to the principal wife of the pharaoh also being known as Great Wife of Amun. Amun, as well as being the solar deity, was a creator god of Egypt, and it was the wife of the pharaoh who became the highest priestess of Amun's cult, performing each day a ritual which evoked the cycle of creation once more. Therefore, Hatshepsut was part of the embodiment of this power. But as Hatshepsut had not given birth to a son, The usual path would be for Thutmose III's own mother Iset to become king's mother, regent. This was the powerful position behind the throne when a pharaoh was young. When Hatshepsut's own husband Thutmose II ascended the throne, his mother, a secondary wife, did not become regent. Instead, Queen Ahmose took charge of her stepson, and so Hatshepsut had an existing template to follow, and so she became regent for Thutmose III. A mere secondary wife would have little experience of political life, but Hatshepsut, raised since birth as the most important child of the pharaoh due to being his eldest living child, would be received willingly as regent. As Thutmose III was the son of a secondary wife and a pharaoh who also had a mother as a secondary wife, Hatshepsut added legitimacy to his reign. If there was any political disagreement over this arrangement, it isn't in the historical record. From what is known of Thutmose III's early childhood reign, Hatshepsut guided him well. Although a toddler could not be expected to rule as an adult pharaoh, it would have been believed that he would grow into his role. As a child, his presence would be required in religious rituals and festivals, with Hatshepsut by his side, aiding him through. His later reign was controlled and bold, suggesting that his stepmother's tutelage had been in his best interests, and he hadn't been raised without the discipline required of a strong and restrained pharaoh. This was also the point at which Hatshepsut's duties as regent and her later role as a female pharaoh began to shift and blur together. As part of strengthening Thutmose III's role, she embarked on a program of building works, of rebuilding and expanding temples throughout Egypt and Nubia. On the one hand, this was a way of ensuring Thutmose's roles and deeds were remembered and advertised, but the painted and carved images were also a way of showing herself in power. Thutmose was shown as a man, as a pharaoh, but always by his side was Hatshepsut. She chose to be portrayed as God's wife of Amun and king's wife, a reminder of her own power. Despite all of this, ancient Egypt was still primarily run on a patriarchal system. While women were sometimes tolerated as regents or rulers for the sake of maintaining the royal bloodline, it was always seen as a temporary measure. Sobekneferu, the first female pharaoh, had reigned only for around 3 to 4 years until her death found her replaced with a male king from a new dynasty. But as Thutmose III was so young when he claimed the throne, Hatshepsut would be in the unprecedented position of being regent for many years. She cemented this in her second year as regent by having herself carved in the reliefs at Semna Temple in Nubia alongside the gods, with the goddess Satet saying, "She is the daughter who has come forth from your limbs. With a loving heart you have raised her, for she is your bodily daughter." These were the actions of a male king, as heir, builder and royal official, without actually calling herself as such. A few years before she was officially crowned as pharaoh, Hatshepsut also made a decision to change her formal title from God's wife of Amun to king's eldest daughter. This was a clear shift from being a queen to being the rightful heir in the royal line, and a block from Karnak Temple, carved a few years later, portrays Hatshepsut in the dress of a queen, but wearing a king's atef crown over a short masculine wig, and the text to accompany it, titled Hatshepsut as "One of the Sedge and of the Bee," which translates as King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The foundations of her later kingship were being laid during her regency by using slow and careful steps in how her image was changed. Although she was pushing against the rules of Egyptian kingship, she seems to have been deliberate enough that she was supported in her endeavour. The priests of the Amun temple helped her, in that an oracle from their temple directly foretold her becoming pharaoh, and Hatshepsut used this in texts to solidify her right to rule. There are little details of when exactly she was crowned, but it is thought by most Egyptologists to have happened sometime around year 7 of Thutmose III's rule. She would later provide an idealised version of events for her coronation, in which the priests and courtiers around her were awed by the sight of her crown and laid themselves flat to the floor and bowed before her. Hatshepsut then proclaimed herself the rightful heir to her father, being obedient only to Amun's wishes. Then, to mark her initiation, she formally changed her birth name to Kenemetan Namen Hatshepsut, or Hatshepsut united with Amun, indicating that she had merged with the male god. She also had other throne names that always kept the feminine words or endings tied to masculine ones. Hatshepsut was not attempting to cover up her gender, but instead to merge it with a position of male power and be flexible where it was needed. But the strangest thing of all about Hatshepsut's rise to power, kingship and supported coronation was that there was already a young king on the throne, even if he was still a child. But it perhaps shows that those priests and officials around Hatshepsut were distrusting of the boy king's reign and stability, and wanting to keep their positions, were willing to help a woman rise to the place of king in order to preserve the dynasty they served. But Hatshepsut never fully ruled alone, instead creating a co-kingship alongside Thutmose III. While we have no records of any personal feelings between the two rulers, it's likely that the young boy, as he grew older and was educated on Egypt's history and politics, would find his co-rule more strange, and perhaps even resented it. Hatshepsut, for her part, had to find ways to be a king within the confines of this relationship. She had to find ways to assert her dominance, but unlike a male king, it would not have been a good idea for her to go off on a military campaign and expose her weaknesses. Instead, Hatshepsut settled on another way in which to prove her strength and power: exploration. A dangerous expedition south was planned, with ships built in Koptos brought across the desert to the coast, where they would set sail on the Red Sea. Their destination was possibly 1,000 miles away, for the land of Punt. While the exact place is now lost to us, Punt is thought to have been somewhere along the coastline of Somalia, Djibouti or Eritrea. The journey was to establish trade and bring back commodities, but Hatshepsut also wanted to have all the elite families of Egypt talking about her voyage in awed tones, a journey this long rarely taken in their history. It was a huge success, and in the 9th year of her joint reign, the ships returned with fragrant incense, expensive ebony wood, and flowers from the exotic rainforests of Punt. The sailors had stories of the new birds, fish and animals they had seen on their journey, and of the small houses on stilts that the people of Punt lived in. The goods even included several living incense trees with their roots, destined to be planted at Karnak and Deir el-Bahari's temples to ensure a supply for many generations. Hatshepsut wasted no time in having joyful images of the voyage's landing carved everywhere, including at her temple at Djezer-Djezeru. Such a dangerous journey had been a gamble, but was one that paid off. Hatshepsut was now firmly seen as the rightful king. In the eyes of her people, If she had been a usurper, the voyage would have failed. Hatshepsut also continued with a tried and tested method she had employed during her regency, that of building projects. In the 16th year of her reign, she ordered 2 large obelisks to be made to commemorate her kingship. One of these broke and had to be replaced by a third, but the broken obelisk is today known as the Unfinished Obelisk, still in situ at Aswan, where it was left. She also created a temple now called Chapelle Rouge, or the Red Temple of Hatshepsut. It was created as a bark shrine, a temple designed as a vessel that would aid Amun, the sun deity, in crossing the night sky ready for the next morning. But her masterpiece of building was that of her mortuary temple at her complex at Deir el-Bahari, opposite the city of Luxor. Construction began as soon as she was crowned and continued for the next 2 decades until the end of her reign. It was designed with huge ramps to take people higher and elevate them, and large stages where many hundreds of people could stand and take part in the festivals Hatshepsut regularly put on. Even the material of the temple was a first for any Egyptian pharaoh, the entire temple being constructed exclusively out of sandstone. The strength and hardness of it allowed for taller and grander buildings to be created. The temple was even constructed to allow, when standing at its highest point, views across to Karnak and Hatshepsut's obelisks and new buildings there. Everything about Hatshepsut's temple was to celebrate the continuation of her even after death. But her temple also included a story fashioned of her divine birth. Carved reliefs showed a story in which Amun, in the body of Thutmose I, coupled with Ahmose in order to conceive a child. The god Khnum, who created the bodies of children, was instructed to make a body, along with Hatshepsut's Ka or spirit. Khnum and Heket, a goddess of fertility, then appeared by Ahmose's side as Hatshepsut was born. Hatshepsut's own appearance through her kingship changed to fit her new role. She now dressed herself in a cut headcloth topped with a uraeus, a cobra crown, along with a male kilt over her queen's robes. Her statues also took on this dual nature. She is depicted as a feminine ideal for the time in many ways. Symmetrical large eyes, a delicate nose, a smiling mouth, and is slender but shapely. However, her statues also usually include her false beard, crowns or kilt, the symbols of her male power. On painted images, Hatshepsut's form would include all the regalia of a male king, but her skin would be painted in the yellow that represented noble females, not the red ochre of a male figure. When Hatshepsut was depicted as one of the gods she embodied, it was often in the form of that god, as other pharaohs before her had been depicted. As time went on, Hatshepsut, perhaps alongside Thutmose III growing into a young adult by her side, felt the need to become more male, not just on her images, but in her own outward appearance. The changes in her iconography suggest that over time, Hatshepsut simply stopped wearing queen's robes beneath the pharaoh's kilt, perhaps binding her breasts or simply leaving them uncovered during rituals in the temple. She also began to wear a false beard, something that had equally been worn in the past by male pharaohs, but for Hatshepsut would serve to indicate more of her masculine power as king. There is also no evidence that her being a woman made Hatshepsut more of a pacifist. There is evidence during her reign that Egypt had foreign wars to the south of its borders during the co-reign of Thutmose III and herself. As Thutmose III grew into a young man, it's likely that he would have taken on the traditional role of a junior ruler in heading these campaigns himself, while Hatshepsut maintained the political balance back home. However, there is also evidence in the tomb of the official Jehuti that Hatshepsut herself travelled with her troops to Kush on campaign in around year 12, even personally engaging in collecting the spoils of war. There were two benefits to this. Ancient Egypt's wealth and prosperity was maintained by subjugating the territories around it, and Hatshepsut would have known this from a young age. It was also in her best interest to have the young Thutmose III, possibly now married to her daughter Nefrure, trained as a skilled and experienced general. But it would not last forever, and in the 22nd year of her reign, Hatshepsut died. While it cannot be certain how she died, a mummy, since possibly identified as Hatshepsut's, showed death through use of a benzopyrene carcinogenic skin lotion that she had amongst her possessions. This is alongside other evidence of her family members also suffering from inflammatory skin diseases. If the mummy really is hers, and Hatshepsut herself suffered from these, use of her skin lotion may well have eventually given her bone cancer. But there is doubt over the identification of the mummified body, considered by some to be Hatshepsut. Whatever the truth, she had prepared for her journey into the next life long before that point, by extending the burial chamber in her father's tomb, probably the first in the Valley of the Kings. However, at some later point, another tomb was prepared for Thutmose I, and his mummified body was moved, and Hatshepsut's body was taken and placed elsewhere. This was likely due to the attempted obliteration of Hatshepsut's memory that occurred towards the end of Thutmose III's reign and into the rule of his son, Amenhotep II. Amenhotep had a very weak claim to the throne. His own father's non-royal mother had allowed Hatshepsut to lay claim as the rightful heir to Thutmose I, successfully creating a new story in which she carried the divine bloodline. Amenhotep, like his father and grandfather before him, was again born to a secondary wife. In the face of the incredible story Hatshepsut had woven for her people, to allow her to be understood as the male and female claimant to the double crown of Egypt, in the face of her incredibly successful attempts to solidify herself as the rightful heir, Amenhotep II was left with little choice but to remove her memory in order to establish his own reign as a strong one. Her cartouches and reliefs were chiselled out, covered up or smoothed over. Her statues were smashed and disfigured, those at the Deir el-Bahari temple also being thrown into a pit and buried. Attempts everywhere were made to obliterate her name from her achievements, or to pass them off as Amenhotep II's own. Amenhotep placed his name over Hatshepsut's to try and sell the idea that he had built her grand monuments or temples. Further to this, Amenhotep II discarded many royal female titles, including that of God's wife to Amun, and not recording any of the names of his own queens. It was a clear and vicious attempt to prevent any royal woman ever again getting ideas above her station and trying to become a male pharaoh, a god. It's also possible that Thutmose III wanted some of Hatshepsut's temples and statues either defaced, destroyed and replaced with his name in order to re-establish himself as the senior ruler in their strange partnership. Whatever the truth, the campaign to erase Hatshepsut was, thanks to the intense research and work of modern Egyptologists, unsuccessful. While many areas of her life remain shadowy, such as her age or means of death, her personal feelings, or even the year she was born. Enough details exist that her reign can be reconstructed. Hatshepsut was an extraordinary woman, an Egyptian princess that understood the gravity of holding on to her family's dynasty and the stability required for a prosperous Egypt. She was willing to do anything to maintain that, turning herself into an androgynous female pharaoh who used her feminine power to strengthen a male role and prepare her stepson Thutmose III for his own kingship. She may not have been the very first female pharaoh of Egypt, but Hatshepsut was certainly the first female pharaoh who thrived over a golden era. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.